Welcome to the Health, Happiness, and Planet podcast. Today, I'm excited to introduce a guest whose journey from pain and exhaustion to vitality will inspire anyone seeking a healthier, more empowered life. Petra Fisher is a recognized mobility coach and foot health expert dedicated to helping people rediscover their body's natural strength and movement potential. Petra's journey is remarkable. After working demanding hours as a lawyer in Canada, her body broke down from chronic injuries like plantar fasciitis, shin splints, and hip pain. Told she'd never walk again without orthotics, Petra refused to accept that diagnosis. She left her high-stress career, engaged herself in the world of movement, and completely transformed her health. Now, through her Build Better Feet program and other innovative approaches to mobility, Petra empowers others to live pain-free, stronger, and happier lives. In this episode, we dive into why foot health is the foundation of overall wellness, how modern technology and footwear affect our movement, and practical steps you can take to improve balance, stability, and mobility. We also explore the importance of grip strength, floor sitting, hanging exercise, and the lessons Petra has learned while traveling the world. We even covered some statistics on how having weak foot strength can potentially shorten your lifespan. Get ready to move smarter and live happier with Petra Fisher. You are listening to Health, Happiness, and Planet podcast, where we explore different ways to boost our well-being, live a more fulfilling life, and protect our planet. Join me as I chat with inspiring people and professionals from all over the world, uncovering strategies for improving our lifestyles and nurturing our precious planet. I am Juan, and this podcast is proudly brought to you by Wave Business Excellence Footprint, my digital training company that cares about your career and personal development. I am passionate about making the world a better place, so if you share my enthusiasm, this show is for you. Together, we can steer towards a healthier, happier life while leaving a positive footprint on our beautiful Earth. Join me as we explore how being healthy, happy, and caring for our planet are all connected. Hello, Petra, and welcome to the Health, Happiness, and Planet podcast. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you, Juan. It's delightful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so happy you were able to join us in this conversation because I've been following your Instagram account for a while now, and it's amazing. I can really encourage anybody to just take a look at your account because you have so many practical tips about anything that has to do with our body and movement, and a lot of things that people can learn. It's just those little learning nuggets that makes it so valuable to look into your account. So thanks again for that.
It's my pleasure.
And one thing that really struck me is to see where you came from. Yeah, so you started all the way from having I would say, almost a career start into the area of becoming a lawyer. Maybe you could just please tell us your journey on how did working as a lawyer lead to physical pain that you had, and what lessons did you take from that chapter of your life into the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, for sure. That's the question everybody always asks me. I was a bit of an accidental lawyer. I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I went into law for all the wrong reasons. I went in because I knew I could make some money and I could get some social respect, and I thought that would be a good career. And I got into it and I hated it. So, on the subject of happiness, it was certainly a big wake-up call that that was not the right world for me. But it was an interesting physical experience because it's a very demanding job in terms of just the time at your desk. And I was working in 2005, 2006. So right before the financial crisis, which was a really busy time doing mergers and acquisitions in Canada, which is where I was working. So I would frequently work, 16, 17-hour days. I would sleep under my desk at night and wake up the next morning at 6 to work. So you can imagine it wasn't very good for my body. I also have always loved intense exercise, and so I was running a lot at the time. And the result ended up being an awful lot of chronic body issues. So, plantar fasciitis, neck pain, hip pain. I always had to be in physiotherapy. So, I was never running and I was always working and I was stressed and I hated it. So, I knew I needed to do something else. And I was lucky because I got laid off when the crash happened. And that was the best thing for me because I switched to a sort of an intermediary job. I worked in public policy in the government for about 8 years and had a chance to kind of step back and do some exploring. And I was still trying to figure out all of my body issues. So I went to massage therapists and physiotherapists and, all the therapists. And all of it helped, but none of it stuck. But I sort of started to realize through that I loved bodies and I thought it was really interesting to learn about bodies and to, see these people who had careers helping. And I was like, I'd like to do that. And the day that it really stuck for me was when I tried rehab Pilates for the first time. So it was my first movement session, and it was somebody who was talking about how to move in better ways. And I did one session. I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is exactly the missing piece because I noticed that there were a lot of kind of major body mistakes I was making that were definitely contributing to how I was feeling. So after that, it was just a question of diving deep into it. And I was lucky because my first teacher is Katie Bowman. Katie is a
Wow.
biomechanist who is
Yeah.
renowned for her work in kind of re-understanding movement and the human body. And she's sort of really been my mentor and a huge influence on my teaching. So I certified with her about, I guess, 11 years ago now. And it's just been kind of diving
Fantastic.
deeper since then.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that was my first contact regarding mobility and movement. So
Mm,
I read the first books from
okay.
Katie Bowman, and the way how she put it into words and the way how she describes movement, it was in such a nice way and understandable for
Mm.
any person who is not in that field. Wow. So that you are the student from Katie Bowman, I did not know that one. That's amazing.
Yep, yep. I studied a lot with Katie. I was one of her teachers in her teacher training program, and I
Mhm.
continue to be certified with Katie. So that's super cool that we have a connection. I
Yeah.
definitely, her work is amazing, and I agree. It's super accessible. So, it's
Yeah.
funny. I was just teaching a class on her book, Move Your DNA, to my membership program this weekend, and every time I reread that book, and I've reread it 10 or 20 times now, there's always something in it that makes my brain just go a little
Yeah,
on
yeah.
fire. It's awesome.
Exactly. I think one of the things that really struck to me also is that nutritious movement. Yeah, because I always thought, yeah, nutrition is about food for your body, but I never thought, what movement, nutritious movement, what is this all about? Yeah, and then she
Mhm.
started describing like, well, a lot of the technology that we have today is taking away our movement. For example, if I am opening, I would say the back of my car, yeah, instead of using my arms and really like grabbing the trunk compartment from the top and pulling it down, I'm just clicking on a button in my key and it's just doing it all by itself. So it's taking away all the movement that we could naturally do as a human being, but it's been robbed by the technology. So from there, I was really like putting a lot of pieces together, thinking like, wow, that's amazing. Because everything I look around us, it's just things taking away our liberty to move. Yeah, if it's the electrical stairs, if it's the elevator, if it's the kitchen appliances that is helping us to squeeze the orange juice because we just have to press a button and anything. It's like, wow,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
amazing that we're really lacking movement because of our advancements that we have.
Well, it's a sort of an unholy alliance between our biology and our technology because our biology is 100% lazy, right? We are designed to conserve energy. It makes perfect sense in a world where we would have to go out and forage for food that we would want to do less all the time. But in a world where we can buy food from someone who will deliver it to us, it doesn't make sense anymore at all. So, the world has changed, but our biology hasn't. And I think that's what we're struggling with right now.
Exactly. So, therefore, movement really changed your life and inspired you then to share all of these great things that you have today, that you're doing these programs. And before I dive deep into one of them, maybe you could just give us like an overview. What are the different programs that you offer?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I've really tried to help people, not so much with exercise, but with movement. And so you already
Mhm.
put your finger on kind of the word nutritious movement. So it's not just movement quantity, which is that, we need
Mhm.
to move more all day long. It's also moving in certain ways. And those can be big picture ways and small picture ways. So arguably, not even arguably, you're doing something different for your body if you go for a 2 hour bike ride and if you go for a 2 hour walk. And it's still great to go for a bike ride, but your body evolved in a walking world. And I believe all the movements that we evolved doing deliver a specific nutritional profile to our bodies. So you take away something different from your walk than from your bike ride. And I think that what you get from your walk is probably more nutritious than what you get from your bike ride. Probably. There's arguments all these ways, but essentially what I've tried to do with my programs is help people refine their understanding of their own bodies so that they can get better at some of the basic nutritional food groups that you can get from movement. So if you think about it, a human in nature, we would have walked a lot, we would have squatted a lot, and we would have climbed and dug things and pulled on things a lot. All of those movement patterns deliver nutritional loads to our bodies. The problem that most of us encounter, though, is that when we take a body that has been, I guess, adapted to a modern environment, is that it's very hard to ask that body to go and do those things without seeing your body do it in different ways than you would have if you'd been doing it all along. For example, for most 50-year-olds to ask them to go and swing on the monkey bars is a huge thing to ask because you haven't swung on the monkey bars for the last however many years, 35 years. To do it safely, to do it well, to do it in a way that's beneficial for you, you need to do micro movements. You need to readapt. So a lot of my programs are the readaptation pieces to help you get the benefit of the big picture movement. So I work a lot on joint mobility. I work a lot on feet because they're so foundational for all other movement. I work on breathing patterns, restoring core function. So I've got a pelvic floor program that's a lot about breathing and a lot about hips. My main joint mobility program is kind of a self-care practice for your joints to give you a lot of that kind of, it's like a vitamin for your body in the absence of all that all day movement. And I just created a new program called Mini Moves that's super fun for the busy person who just wants a toolbox of tiny little things that you can do during your regular life. So it's
Yeah.
52 tiny moves that you can kind of sprinkle into your day. So I think of it as like the salad topper of the movement world because all
Wow.
of that counts. All those little pieces make a difference.
Exactly. Really nice to hear that. And I'm definitely going to put all those links in the show notes. So whoever is right now not able to take notes, then they can just take a look. But I'm really happy to see those mini moves because I'm also quite busy throughout the day. I have this digital business. And, sometimes if I don't watch out, I'm just really sitting a little bit too long than I should. I know that a lot of my listeners are also from the corporate world. So therefore, this would be definitely a value added for us. So thank you for creating
Yeah,
that.
I created it because I do them all the time too. Like we could do them
Yeah.
right now while we're
Yeah.
talking. You know what I mean? That was
Wow.
the point. So yeah.
Very nice, very nice. So then let's start with basics because I know there's so many topics we could talk about today that we probably need like 5 hours just to cover the basics. Yes, so therefore we just start with the foundation, and the foundation are our feet. Many people think, well, feet are just something that we have down there somewhere, and but if I have knee pain, then I'm going to check what's wrong with my knee, or if I have hip pain, what's wrong with my hip. But then they do not know, well, what about checking what's going on with your feet, which is the foundation, and maybe that's having some type of an effect somewhere up the chain. So maybe you could tell us how important is foot health to the overall health of our mobility in our body?
Yeah, for sure. I actually, when I started moving my business online, the very first thing I did was create a free giveaway about feet because I think feet are a really, really smart place to start because they're so important. They're so important to everything. They are what connects us to the ground. And a foot that's not working well is going to often be unhappy in itself, develop foot issues, but it's also going to have an impact on the movement all the way up our bodies. So it's a really good idea to restore your feet just from that kind of what you stand to gain from it. Perspective. But the other thing that's important to remember with our feet is that most of us are starting out with really sad feet, and it's not our fault. It's no one's fault. But we've grown up in a world wearing shoes for the most part, and those are shoes that have raised heels and stiff soles and narrow toes, and those squash our feet and they immobilize our feet and they stiffen and weaken our feet. So your feet are probably in bad shape. So you've got this foot that has a really big impact on your body that's almost certainly in really bad shape, and that makes it a very high impact part of your body that you can work on. So, if you've got to pick
Yeah.
one body part to work on, it's often a really good choice.
Yeah. Now that you've described that, it just reminds me of when somebody has an injury, let's say a bone injury, and has a cast, and they take away the cast, and then that part of the body is usually very weak, and it has to be also worked on a little bit to gather its strength again. And somehow I have that vision, like having those stiff shoes in your feet. It's just like putting your feet for 8 or 10 hours a day in a cast, and then you expect them to be strong. Yeah. So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's very well put. And the funny thing is, it's not like we don't move. We obviously still walk. So what we're doing is literally like putting your feet in cast and then walking around. So your feet are still being walked on, but they can't participate in the movement. And so now you're walking on very stiff, very weak feet. So you're loading them all the time, even though they can't do anything. So you can imagine, like, it's no surprise that there's so many foot issues.
Yeah. So, what would you say is the most common foot problems you see, and how can people address that without going maybe first into those costly surgeries and things that at the end could be even worse, because I've heard that surgeries on the feet are usually more complicated than other surgeries in the body because it's very, very delicate because there's so many joints, so many muscles and ligaments. So let's maybe start with the first part of the question. Which are the major foot problems you see mostly?
Yeah, so I think the good news about foot problems is that for the most part, what they really are is I've adapted to shoe problems. And so you can call them foot problems and diseases, but for the most part, really they can be fixed by restoring your foot strength and mobility. And so you can split them up into specific problems. But the nice thing is that they pretty much all respond well to a smart, intelligent strengthening and mobility process. So I would say that, the ones that come up all the time are plantar fasciitis. So plantar fasciitis is when the connective tissues of the feet become damaged. That usually happens because the feet are overloaded. So a weak foot is used too often, is sort of how I think about overloads. Bunions are very common, and it's quite interesting actually, but bunions are where the big toe joint kind of diverts and gets pulled out of place, and the toe dives in towards the midline of the foot. It can become quite painful and it can become a bony issue. So, where it becomes a bony issue, movement is no longer as useful, but can still be useful because you can still restore the movement around it. And that happens very much because we have narrow toe boxes on our shoes, raised heels on our shoes, and limited hip rotation. And that pushes that toe joint into the wrong place. All kinds of kind of crinkly toe issues, so hammer toes and mallet toes, because again of that being squashed. Neuromas are really big. So, a neuroma is where the nerves that travel between the foot bones get irritated. So, there again, squashed feet that are being compressed by shoes, that are being compressed by our bodies, those can turn into nerve issues quite easily because you're irritating the nerve. So, I would say those are the ones that come up the most often, but really any foot pain issue that you can think of, the chances are high that it's related to our shoe and our walking history.
Wow. I remember a few years back when I used to work in the corporate world and I used to be in a suit and those office shoes. I really did not like walking that much. I was happy when I could get my car parked as close as I could to the elevator, where I would just go into the elevator and then up into the office to my desk. And if I would go to the gym, then I would have to park the closest I could to the door of the gym so I do not have to walk across the parking lot. Things like that, just because my feet were just not fit enough. They were not happy to be walking.
Mm.
Some of my listeners might know that I did a transition now that I'm very often without shoes. So now it's like, wow, I couldn't even live a day without doing my 10,000 steps because it's just such a joy to be walking and getting all that stimulation and feeling nature. Thanks for, first of all, listing those different types of problems that one could get. And is it true that perhaps women have more issues than men because they tend to be maybe more time in high heels and when you look at a lot of those magazines that are just trying to promote like all those really tight stilettos, and perhaps they're more vulnerable to have foot issues than men. Is that true?
I think that, shoe design is a spectrum. And even if you're looking at, a flat-ish shoe like a Vans or a Converse, those still have a narrow toe box and they still have a raised heel, even if it's invisible. So it's incredible how they sneak it in. But 100%, the higher the heel, the bigger the loads on your foot, the
Yeah.
stranger the impact on your gait. And women are almost exclusively the ones with the particularly bad shoes, although there's some pretty terrible men's shoes out there as well if you
Yeah.
look hard enough. But yeah, for sure, women do tend to have more foot problems than men. But I don't think it's because of being female. I think it's
Yeah.
because of our shoe choices.
That's right. And the influence that we get from like social media, like how you're supposed to look, what type of shoes you should be wearing, and it's sometimes a little bit that social pressure that you get to look a certain way, and
Sure.
make thinking that it's going to make you feel better because you look better.
Oh my goodness, you should have seen my shoes when I was a lawyer. I always had the
Yeah.
highest heels. I'm pretty short, so I was like, I want the highest heels. But it's super interesting. There are a lot of minimal shoes out there now. There's a
Mhm.
whole range of shoes that meet the needs of our feet better than conventional footwear, that are foot shaped and that allow our feet to function better. And many of them are quite attractive. So there is 100% social pressure to wear a certain type of footwear. But I think people who are not familiar with the range of barefoot shoes in the world will be surprised to find how attractive some of them are.
Exactly. And the same I can say also for the men's world, because I do have to travel sometimes to do certain business workshops with my clients. And I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to wear now? Because I sometimes I don't wear shoes for such a long time. So, and I finally went to Barefoot shop a few weeks back and I found some really nice shoes that I say, hey, this one I could actually wear with my suit. Yeah. And it's perfect. They're still Barefoot shoes. I have enough space to spread my toes out. It's flat, it's flexible. And so I was really happy about that advancement.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Great.
really important because not everybody can be barefoot all the time,
Yeah.
and you need to find that point where your social needs and your physical needs can be met together. And so having those choices is wonderful. And I agree,
Yeah.
there's some great men's shoes out there also.
Fantastic. Can weak or poorly aligned feet be linked then to other problems like knee pain, back pain, hip pain, and so forth?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think we've already alluded to that a little bit, but I think it's almost hard to fully understand how much of a link there is until you start diving into the world of movement and start to realize your own restrictions. So again, your feet connect you to the world. So a poorly functioning foot is going to send strange forces all the way up your body.
Yeah.
So your feet and your hips are very closely linked. I think that's the number one thing to think about. So a foot that's not functioning well or a hip that's not functioning well will tend to go together. And they tend to go together in our culture also because people who've worn shoes with heels and people who've sat in chairs a lot are often the same people. So what you get right off the starting point is a hip that doesn't like to go back behind the pelvis very far,
Mm.
and often a hip that doesn't like to rotate very much because the essential movement of the foot is called a pronation and a supination. And people are often told that they overpronate or that they oversupinate. And that tends to be a way of describing the fact that they've gotten stuck in one side of that movement pattern. It doesn't mean that the movement pattern is bad. The movement pattern is essential. So the way we walk, the way our feet should behave when we walk, is that as we strike on our heel, our foot should be fairly rigid. As we pass over the foot, it should soften and pronate and that absorb shock. And then as we move to that foot being behind us, it will be part of our push up. It'll become rigid again. It'll twist. And that twisting is a supination. So the foot twists and untwists to absorb shock or to push us forward in space. But that twisting, which gets lost in a conventional shoe because of the stiffness of the sole and often because of the squishing of our toes, because our toes are involved in creating this motion. Once that gets lost, you also miss out on rotation in the knee, and you miss out on rotation at the hip, and you miss out in extension of the hip. The hip cannot go backwards far enough. So now you're getting this very limited amount of hip movement in your walking. And when you have limited hip movement in your walking, you've got to get that movement from somewhere else. So you might get it from your knees. You can kind of bend your knees and sort of trot forwards. You can wiggle your hips side to side and kind of sashay forwards. You can get a lot of it from your spine. And that's great because you're walking, so that's awesome. But it's not as optimal as it would be if you were getting it from your hips, which is how your body will move most efficiently and effectively. So you're going to see potentially symptoms appear in your knees, in your hips, in your pelvic floor, in your low back, even in your upper back and shoulders, because all those movements tend to be a throwing forward of the body that doesn't need to happen because of that foot hip connection. So when that's missing, the body can't move forward as efficiently, and the forces and the loads on everything upstream are not as helpful for the body as they could be.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing how it's all connected. Yeah. And
It's crazy, crazy.
normally when you think, I go to the doctor and say, okay, you got to go to the knee specialist or, oh, you got to go to the hip specialist. I'm thinking like, but isn't there one person who's specialized for my end to end? Yeah. My body it's like,
No, it's too much. It's too
yeah.
much. There's so much to think about.
Yeah. Have you experienced also with your clients maybe that, I mean, that's just one observation that I had, for example, when people take off their shoes and they walk for the first time without any shoes, that they do the heel strike like very, very hard on the floor. So they cannot like dose it because they're just so used to it having a lot of cushioning in their shoes that when they walk without the shoes, you hear them like hammering. You're just like bang, bang, bang. And you hear them walking. And I think that was one of the things that I had to focus on, and also my wife had to focus on when we started to walk barefoot, that we were just not doing it so hard on the floor, that heel strike, because I never thought of it before. And I was thinking, wow, that's interesting. Yeah. So that means that every time I used to travel to see my clients and I had shoes on for 1 or 2 days, and I would be coming back again home and I would take them off, and then I would just fall back to the way how I would walk with my shoes on. So I would
Sure.
begin like hammering the floor, and then I was thinking, oh, wow, focus. Yeah. Be more conscious when you walk. Just be very, very mindful in the way how I step on the floor. Is this something that you have also observed, this very hard heel strike?
Yeah, it's super common. And I think that it comes from a variety of factors. So, number one is that the muscles on the sides of our hips are actually part of how we should be lifting our other leg when we walk. It's a bit of a complex kind of technical movement thing, but if those muscles are working well, they will lift and lower your pelvis as you walk, including a gentle lowering rather than a slamming down. So they control your descent. Controlling descent is very important in movement. So if you don't have strong side hip muscles,
Mhm.
then you're going to tend towards a heavy heel strike.
Yeah.
On top of that, it's actually really interesting. Um, there's been some research around the amount of cushion used in shoes. And when you put somebody into a more heavily cushioned shoe, what we do is we heel strike harder. Our brains like to hear the ground. We depend on our feet, not just for all the kind of walking stuff, but also for sensation and telling our brains where we are in the world. And so, our brains, when there's a ton of cushion, they hit harder, presumably, so they can get some feedback from the ground. So, my guess is that we are trained to hit hard because all of us walk with cushion. And so, you go barefoot for the first time, you're like, oh my goodness. Um, you're still in this kind of heavy thumping ground. Now, I was a giant thumper too. I was a bit appalled when I learned I was a thumper. And that's really changed as I've been on my personal barefoot journey. I've got a lot more svelte with my walking now.
Yeah, yeah. Now you're like a ninja. Yeah, nobody can hear it when you're
So
coming.
amazing. Silent.
Exactly. I noticed that as well. Sometimes when I'm walking somewhere and people just get scared, they just like jump away, like, whoa, I didn't even know you were coming. Where did you come from? Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I was walking right next to you.
Just walking.
Yeah,
That's awesome. That's
exactly.
awesome.
And there's a very scary statistic that I saw recently on Google, that it said that falls are a leading cause of injury in the elderly. And
Mm.
according to the World Health Organization, about 37 million falls require medical attention per year. And these falls are the second leading cause of universal injury deaths globally. So could have been a part of that falls that people are having prevented through stronger feet and exercising and really paying attention on their foot health?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you'll never know 100% for sure, but I feel like there's several pieces to that puzzle. So number one is that sensational piece. If you're in a big, heavy, clumpy shoe and you can't feel the world around you, you've got a fuzzy image of what's happening in the world. You cannot walk with as much control. Number two is a squashed foot is a smaller foot. You don't have as big a base of support as you would if you were barefoot or in a barefoot shoe. And number three is that your hips are a huge part of your stabilizing mechanism. And if you've limited your hip movement for the last 60 years, you are unlikely to have as much control as you walk. So, another interesting stat is that about 80% of your walking is a single legged movement. So you're on one leg for 80% of your walking time. Having good single legged balance is 100% going to translate to more stability when you walk. So when you're walking, you can't always tell if you're unstable because you have momentum to drive you forward, but you can tell that one time when your toe hits a little ledge, and if that throws you off, then that's the time you fall. And if you've trained your feet, if you trained your hips to be more comfortable on varied terrain and to be stronger in a more natural, varied environment, you're going to have a much lower risk
Hmm.
of actually falling when that happens.
Yeah, that's amazing. I even saw somewhere that there's like number of seconds that you can stand on one leg. You're supposed to close your eyes. You're supposed to cross your arms, and just to see how many seconds you can hold your balance. Then they could more or less tell you what age group you are. And then we did that test a few weeks ago with my wife, and she was okay. Well, how many seconds am I supposed to stand on one leg? And I said, well, you do the exercise first, I'll measure. And then, she stood on one leg, she closed her eyes, she crossed her arms. And then, like, after 3 minutes, I said, you know what, you can stop it because
You're 12 years old.
Exactly. You're like minus 12.
You're not even born yet. What's going on? That's
Exactly.
awesome. That's
And she was like,
awesome.
well, what does the chart say? Well, I told her, well, it's more in seconds, not in minutes. Yeah. So-
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then I did the test as well. And also, I was a couple of minutes. I mean, at the end, we just had to stop because I was okay, how long am I
Yeah.
supposed to do
Yeah.
this? And it was really eye opener to me that I'm thinking, wow, what a balance do we have by really being most of the time barefoot. We do it all types of terrain. And when every time we have a guest that comes to our house, sometimes we would just do the game with them. It's like, hey, how long can you hold on one leg? Close your eyes. It's like, maybe like 3 seconds.
I totally want to come visit you. I think we're going to get along
Yeah.
really well. Well, I think you've also put your finger on one of the really nice things about working on your feet is going outside and into nature. If you're in a shoe that allows the texture of the world to impact your feet, that's a huge foot exercise all by itself. It doesn't take you any extra time. You're on a nice hike, but you can get such a great load for your feet. It really does wonders for your feet if you can walk in nature, either barefoot or in a thinner soled shoe.
Exactly. And there was one program that I was looking at recently, also about foot health, and they were showing the different movements that people can do at the beginning when they're just transitioning from their normal shoe life to one maybe into a barefoot shoe. And I was thinking like, wow, but a lot of those exercises is what my foot does naturally when we are walking in nature. So it's exactly like you said just now, that if you do have the possibility to be in nature, you will be probably doing like 70 to 80% of all the exercises that you would need to do in a foot program. But of course, to be in nature barefoot, I think one really has to transition in a slower pace. And that's why it's probably good to first prepare your feet. And that's why your programs also come in handy. So I think your program is called Build Better Feet program. And it aims to help people develop stronger and happier feet. Just out of curiosity for our listeners, first of all, what does your program cover? And what could an exercise, for example, look like that somebody could take as a learning nugget for today?
For sure. Before I get into that, I just want to tell you about my sad story. So, when I was about 2 years, 3 years into my barefoot transition, we went to Hawaii to go for a backpacking
Wow.
trip. And I was super excited to go backpacking in Kauai. And I wore my Vibram Five Fingers and I had my heavy backpack on. Turns out Hawaii, all the hiking trails are covered in these small, round candle nuts or kukui nuts. And they're like little ball bearings, but they're like big
Yeah.
ball bearings. I was in so much pain. I limped for 4 days because I overdid it. So, nature is a great source of loading for our
Yeah.
feet, but you do have to watch your loading and don't be too enthusiastic. That's my suggestion.
Exactly. Wow, that's so nice. And I even think
Okay.
there is one trail in Hawaii, but I'm not so sure which island it is. They named it a Barefoot Trail, and I have not tried that one yet, but on my next trip I will try it out. And they said that they did remove those tricky rocks and everything so that the normal person would be able to to walk comfortably. But yeah, but most trails are wow. That's the highest level that I have ever walked barefoot, and I think that you do need practice, and you do need to have a little bit of training for your feet to be able to do that.
Because you don't think about your feet as something that needs
Mm,
training, especially because you do walk on your feet all the time. You go to a gym, you're like, okay, obviously, I'm not going to bench press 200 pounds today. I'm going to start with bench pressing 50, but it's exactly the same for your feet. You want to start out with the small thing you can do and you build from there. So, that is exactly kind of the goal behind my Build Better Feet program.
mhm.
Build Better Feet is really intended to work on feet holistically. So, it's not just a foot exercise program, it's a way to link up your feet and your hips and all the stuff that contributes to your walking so that you can have a more helpful walk for your body and your health in the long term. So we absolutely sort of zero in on the basics for building foot strength and mobility. In my experience, shoes changing into barefoot shoes will do a lot. There's some research that says it will build strength for sure. What it doesn't always do is rebuild function and capacity. So, we've got these feet that have adapted to our footwear, but there's a readaptation process that sometimes gets stalled if we stop with just changing our shoes. So that's the kind of the idea behind doing the exercises. I work on the foot strength and mobility as the ground point, and then I work on kind of the key components of a more helpful walking cycle. So, opening up the fronts of the hips so that the hips can travel behind your body, working on that lateral hip strength. So, the side hips that we already talked about, which is part of making sure you don't thump your heel down. part of your stability. Also, really big for hip and pelvic floor health. You want to have those strong lateral hips. Working on rebuilding the arches. So the arches have a strong relationship with hip rotation and knee rotation. So we do a lot of knee rotation in the program too, and hip rotational work. And then we work on some balance and natural movement as well, so that you don't just walk forward, or ideally you don't just walk forward. Ideally you're going to take your body out into some environments where you're also moving side to side and maybe stepping over logs and maybe walking on rocks. You want to have that multi-planar movement. That's part of what builds that robusticity so that you aren't as likely to fall in the long run. So
Yeah.
we finished with
Wow.
that. There's so much that can go into a foot program.
Time for a quick break to mention that the sponsor of this podcast is Wave Business Excellence Footprint, a digital training company deeply committed to your career development, personal growth, and the well-being of our precious planet. Dive into a wealth of knowledge with over 20 courses available on our website, www.wave-bef.com, tailored for both managers and employees aspiring to become tomorrow's leaders. One of our best-selling courses is the Presentation and Communication Skills Training, perfect for those creating and delivering presentations in their companies. Whether through video conference or live meetings, if you want to convey your message effectively and do an outstanding job, this course equips you with the skills to be a better creator and presenter. Check out the testimonials on our website. The results speak for themselves. During my time in the corporate world, I often wished I had the opportunity to access such courses at the beginning, making my learning experience quicker. And now, one further topic before we jump back to the conversation. For those of you resonating with the themes of health, happiness, and planet, discover information about our 3-day retreat in Spain by reaching out to my team at the email address hhp@wave-bef.com. You will obtain further information about our life-changing retreat held once a year, together with some of our remarkable podcast guests. Each retreat is unique, leaving you energized with a set of simple tools to take control of your health and happiness sustainably. And the best part, you will be surrounded by like-minded individuals, ending the retreat with a personal action plan shared regularly within the group. One of the things that just struck me right now is the word arches, because I know that the construct of the arch, it's amazing how the foot was built. And those who think that I cannot go barefoot because I have maybe a flat foot, and many times I've seen that a podiatrist would say, well, if you have flat feet, you need inner support in your shoes. But actually, my perception is that this is probably not really strengthening their muscles in order to keep the arch. So what is your input on that?
That's a really good question, and it's one I get a lot also. So I would 100% agree. I think that the arch only gets weaker if you support it artificially. When I was talking earlier about pronation and supination, so that's the untwisting of the foot to absorb shock, and supination is the twisting of the foot to create rigidity. That twisting of the foot is the arch creator. So that's a really important component of our feet. If we have support in there that stops you from untwisting and absorbing shock, you're also missing out on part of the whole process that needs to happen sort of in a healthy midfoot area.
Yeah.
So when you're working on flat feet, you want to work on some intrinsic foot strength, including things like lifting the big toe on its own and working on having the big toes track towards one another when you lift them instead of tracking towards the outside edge of your feet, because that's using the same muscles that help create the arch. You want to work on foot mobility, because even if your feet are flat, that's often not a sign of hypermobility. That's often a sign of stiffness that's kind of collapsed down and that's dragging your ankle down. You want to work on the strength between the foot and the calf. So muscles connect between your foot and your lower leg as well as within the foot itself. So you want to work on those because they again will help create the arch, will help create the supination and the stiffness. And you want to work on your hip and knee rotation because that rotational relationship between your feet and your hips is part of how you create your arches. So that kind of whole package, it's complex, but it's very good work to do because it gives you benefits the whole
Yeah.
way along. It helps your knees, it helps your hips, it helps your pelvic floor as it's helping your feet, as it's developing your arches. So you don't necessarily need to have super high
Mhm.
arches. You can have a flatter foot as long as that foot is able to create a supinated position and a pronated position, then you have a healthy flat foot.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that because I think that's probably one of the things that I've heard quite often by some of the people who I speak with. They said, "Oh yeah, it's so great that you were walking barefoot, but I cannot because, I have a flat foot." So yeah, that's definitely going to equip me with a better answer the next time I meet them.
Well, it gets right back into that adaptation
Yeah.
thing, right? So I was actually told at one point that I would always need to wear orthotics because my feet tend towards flatness
Mm,
also.
yeah.
And I've certainly found that not to be the case. So I'm 10
Mhm.
years into being mostly barefoot or in barefoot shoes all the time. And so far, my body likes it much better. But you want to be smart about it.
Mhm.
You want to do the foot exercises and test the barefoot time and see how things feel and add more exercises if you need to. But the nice thing is that, the barefoot shoes, and especially what we've talked about already, is walking out in nature on natural surfaces. As those mobilize your feet, they strengthen your feet in multiple planes of motion. Your feet are going to create an arch all by themselves.
Mhm.
It's an amazing process. So that is the good news in the process. So I think most people can have great success rebuilding their arches.
Very nice to hear. It's quite amazing if I think about when we think that we're going to the gym and we're going to train our arms, we're going to train our shoulders and legs, but nobody says, I'm going to go train my feet. It's like, what? It's like, and it's also even more interesting that when I started transitioning to not wearing shoes, I was thinking to myself, like, wow, there's so many muscles I've never felt in my life. And I had like muscle pain, like more muscle pain than when I trained my upper body and in my feet area. And that's why I think that if somebody is thinking of transitioning from the regular shoe that we have in the market to the barefoot shoes, then I think there's probably certain things that one can watch out for. And also the speed in the transition that you're doing. So perhaps you could give us a couple of tips and tricks. How do we do this transition?
Yeah, for sure. So everybody's a little different. My boyfriend just switched shoes and he was fine.
Mhm.
But that didn't work out the same way for me. I switched shoes very enthusiastically and ended up giving myself an injury. So everybody is different. I think the most important thing that will help most people is to give yourself two options. So buy a very barefoot shoe or a fairly barefoot shoe with a thin sole that's very flexible. And buy also one with a more cushioned sole that is squishier. So I'm thinking about something like Lem's shoes or Ultra running shoes, something that's cushioned but still has a wide toe and no rise at the heel. And what that will give you is the ability to switch between shoes so that on day number one, when you want to go out and wear your barefoot shoes for 8 hours, instead of doing that, go out and wear your barefoot shoe for 1 hour and see how your feet feel and then adjust accordingly the next day so you can progress. And because you've cleverly given yourself a more cushioned barefoot shoe, you don't have to go back to your old restrictive shoes. You can still wear that other transitional shoe, have some comfort in it because of the cushion, but not necessarily be squashing your toes. So just kind of like adding up progressively is going to be really, really helpful. I also don't want to beat a dead horse, but doing foot exercises is going to be your absolute best friend in this transition. And often it's a good idea to do some foot exercises before you start transitioning so that you're a little bit more prepared once you get into that barefoot shoe. After that, it's going to usually depend a little bit on your feet. So if you have that kind of flatter footed person, you are probably going to want to work on a little bit more strengthening focus than somebody who's a very high arched person. So high arched people often get left out of this conversation, but they also often have very stiff, weak feet, but their feet have kind of crunched themselves up rather than flattened themselves. And so for that person, I would focus more on mobility work. So you were asking me about one of the exercises in my program. This is actually an exercise that I think is great for both flat feet and for high arches to restore mobility. I think it should be an essential exercise for most people who are transitioning. And it's even reminiscent of being out in nature. And what it is you get yourself a small ball, not too hard, not too small, not too big. And instead of rolling your feet on it, what you're going to do is you're going to step on it. You're going to place that ball in a variety of places on your foot. I like to divide up the front of my foot into about 9 spots. And I put the ball underneath each of those 9 spots for about 20 to 30 seconds. And I just kind of step on it and I put some weight onto the ball and I come off and I step on it and I put my weight on and off. So it's a very simple exercise, takes a bit of time, but what it does is it's like stepping on natural things. You're stepping on a small ball, not a rock, so that's nicer for your foot. But it's moving your foot around in ways that you would move in nature. And I like to step back and forth. So I've got my one foot on my ball. I step back and forth with my other foot. That exposes my foot to all these mobilizing forces. And you will notice a big difference between foot number one that you've done and foot number two that you haven't done. And just takes about, like 3 or 4 minutes to do all those 9 spots. And that will give you a lot of those exposure to nature loads in the comfort of your home. You can be sipping on your coffee as you do it, which is the nice thing about a lot of footwork is it's not super technical or focused. So that's a great transitional option, and it's one of the exercises I like the most. And that one is also really good for working on the pronation, supination, unflattening your feet piece because of how it supplizes your foot. So it allows the foot to be better at creating an arch.
Yeah, very good. That's something I think is very much asked, this type of question, because I know that the barefoot shoes are becoming more popular in the market. And a lot of people now thinking, okay, that's, I can just jump straight into my barefoot shoes. But then sometimes, they have a painful experience after one day and they just overdid it, perhaps. They did it a bit too quick. So I think these tips are definitely going to help us for transitioning. And that thing that I also realized from those barefoot shoes that I bought, the ones that I'm going to use now when I do my workshops with my client, it had like a cushioning that you said that inside, so it had like an extra sole inside. So for those who are starting off perhaps the first time, but the salesperson said, hey, if you're already a barefooter, you can just remove that inner cushion because then you can even have more the the feeling of the ground. So that was very nice that you can then say, hey, that's pretty cool because then if I'm starting off, I could have it more cushiony and later on I just remove it and then I can go to the next level. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you can even buy a minimal shoe insole. I think
Hmm.
the company that makes them is called North Soles,
Uh-huh.
like the North Star, but for
Yeah.
your feet. And those have a wider toe box. They can add a little cushion. So that way you may only need one pair of shoes because you can add that cushion. So that's a great point.
Yeah. Fantastic. And one of the things that I realized when I started walking more barefoot, that was probably like 6 years ago. At the beginning, my feet were very sensitive and also that they did not have that much padding under my feet. So therefore, my feet were a bit sensitive because if there was a little pebble on the floor, if there was a little rock, then I would just feel it like very intense because it would go like straight onto the bones of my feet. But then after walking more and more barefoot, it's like if you look at the paws of a dog, yeah, that is like nice and cushiony. So we get like that padding on the soles of the feet. And now when I walk, it's just like having my own cushioning. Yeah. So when I go and into nature, it's like, wow, I barely feel anything compared to 5 years ago when I started off. So the body can really give you what you need. You just have to allow the environment to be there so that your body can start triggering that cushioning effect. So perhaps you could just give us a short information about what is this cushioning, or I think they call it padding or something, and how is this beneficial to have? Because many people think like, wow, what do I need that for?
Well, I'd say there's two things going on usually in terms of that foot. So it's maybe three things in terms of
Mhm.
the foot sensitivity. One is just habituation. Once you start feeling things underfoot for the first time, there's a lot of sensors in the foot. It's a very innervated area because it's supposed to give your brain information about the world. If you go from a world of smooth floors and cushioned shoes into nature, your brain is going to be like,
Like
whoa, it's like a bright light after you've been
overload.
in the dark. Absolutely. Next is that stiffness. So if your feet are very stiff and you push up under one part of your foot, there's going to be more resistance relative to a more mobile foot. So that foot mobilization exercise I talked about just then, I was once in a class where we did that on one foot for about 45 minutes. And then we went outside and walked on gravel. And the difference between foot number one and foot number two was mind-boggling. It is just crazy. It was so much more comfortable on the foot that we just mobilized. So I think stiffness is actually a huge piece of that puzzle. But I love that you brought up fat pads. So our feet come with thick fat pads underneath them, particularly the heel. It's a really interesting part of the body because it's very clearly designed for shock absorption. It's got a very thick layer of tissue to encase the pad, and then there's kind of squishy stuff inside the pad. It's got a different sensitivity to cold than other parts of the fat in our body. It's really interesting. And even our heel bone is really interestingly designed to absorb shock well. So any fat pads are fascinating and we need them because our fat in our body, it's an insulator and it's a cushion. So clearly our heels are a place where, and our feet overall, but our heels maybe mostly because of heel striking and walking, they need to have some cushioning. I don't know if any studies have really dived into this, but anecdotally, what I have heard is that people can, as you've experienced, increase the density and the amount of the fatty padding just from exposing our feet to texture. And to me, that makes a lot of sense because our bodies beef up the stuff that we use all the time. If you want to be lifting weights and hanging from the monkey bars, you're going to get calluses on your hands, and you're also going to get thicker skin on your feet when you start going barefoot, but often not as thick as you think it's going to be because you don't actually need to have a giant, super thick skin. The calluses that we have that are uncomfortable are usually because of pressure points on our feet from a over squashing of our feet rather than from a helpful thickening of the skin. Our muscles increase when we load them more. So our fat pads also seem to do that.
Yeah, fantastic. And since I got them, I always say to my family and friends, these are my Nike Air. Yeah, these are the bodily made Nike Airs. So I don't need all of
So
that high
right.
technology.
So
and
good.
and it's really good because since I have them now developing every year, they really protect me when I go, for example, on cold mornings when I go out with my dog and it's like almost freezing temperatures and I'm like, I barely feel it. I mean, I do know it's cold out there and I the first 3-4 minutes it's a little bit cold, but then if I just keep on moving, I keep on walking and then all that circulation just starts and it doesn't feel cold anymore. And then it's like the warmest part of my body are my feet and people are like, what? How is that even possible? And the same the other way around with summer when it's like super hot and the floors are hot, then also the fatty padding is really protecting me and I don't have to be running like a chicken across the street just to get to the other side of the road.
So interesting. I had a very similar experience one year when I switched to minimal boots. And so the Canadian winter is, I'm from Canada, very snowy. But we went for a hike in the woods, and my feet were so warm because I was on these flexible boots. And even though we were walking on snow, I was moving my feet so much over the snow because of the flexibility that I had so much more circulation in my feet. So it's pretty cool what you can discover as you
Yeah.
start strengthening and mobilizing your feet a little bit more.
Exactly. Wow. It's such a nice topic, especially that I think a lot of people have not experienced that yet. It's almost like rewilding. Yes, like going back to your roots, yeah, to see how our ancestors actually lived their life and how our bodies adapted to the environment. And my next question is more like the psychological part, because if some people are feeling motivated about the topics we're speaking today, to say, okay, I will be doing some exercises, some movements, I'm going to transition maybe to a barefoot shoe, perhaps I will practice to be barefoot from time to time. I know a lot of people have like that barrier because they have like that psychological, like to overcome the fear of what others will think of them when they are barefoot, perhaps in the park or anywhere else. Do you have any tips or tricks from your side with that you maybe experienced yourself that you were able to say to yourself to just to overcome that type of fear?
Oh, I'm the kind of person who's always been like, look, I'm barefoot, ha ha. So I haven't experienced a lot of that myself. I also don't put myself into situations where I think people would tend to think it was weird. So I don't go barefoot at the airport, for example. I don't go barefoot in stores typically. So I don't put myself into that situation so much. So I think this gets back partly to the shoe conversation. If
Yeah.
you're not feeling comfortable with being barefoot, then don't be barefoot. Go ahead and find yourself some barefoot shoes. So I don't think there's any rule that says that, you have to be totally barefoot. So if you're not feeling comfortable, then putting yourself into a pair of shoes that you think are attractive would be a really
Hmm.
good way to ease yourself in. Being around a community of people who are like-minded is useful also. So, I think that movement inspires movement, barefooting inspires barefooting. There is a little bit of a culty kind of feeling around the barefoot world because once you discover it, it's super hard to go back. But that means that there's often meetups of barefoot lovers. There are oft more and more. There's barefoot shoe stores around that you can go to. There's certainly internet online communities. So there's kind of social support for choosing a more healthy barefoot lifestyle around there. And then, I mean, if you really want to go barefoot, I would say just go barefoot for a while, see what it's like.
Exactly. Wow, that's interesting to hear your viewpoint to that. Yeah, because for me, for example, that was I used to be a person who used to worry about what others would think about me, about what type of suit I would have on, what type of watch I would have, what type of car I would drive. So, of course, if I would suddenly take off my shoes, I would think, oh my God, what everybody's going to think about me. So that was like the old me. Yeah. And somehow I transitioned, of course, from working in the corporate world to what I'm doing today. When I look back, I'm thinking like, wow, I really worried about things that there was nothing to worry about. And it's just very superficial types of mindset, the way how I was thinking about the world. So now, of course, I just see, okay, what is it bringing me some type of benefit? Is it making me feel good? Am I happy about it? Then, hey, I don't care about anything else. The main thing that I know it's doing my body good and I'm feeling good. Yeah, so I think that's perhaps one of the things that a lot of people who would like to try it out someday could think, well, especially if I think about my courses of change management says that the satisfaction of the change needs to be higher than the resistance. So once you know how good it feels, then you would not care about the rest because you know the feeling of the goodness is much higher than the resistance of thinking, what would another person think?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I'm thinking about now some of the workshops that I've taught when I teach in-person workshops, and we usually do a park session where we go outside and we walk barefoot around a park. And that's really nice too, because again, you've got some moral support that way. Everybody's feeling it, everybody's doing it. Having 10 people around being barefoot is a really good way to feel more confident trying it. So sometimes going to a live workshop is the perfect way to experience something new like this.
Exactly. Very good. So we're almost coming to the end of our podcast. So I do have some final questions. One of them you already mentioned a bit at the beginning of our conversation, which is about the importance of hanging, yeah, like the grip that you have. So now we're transitioning a little bit away from our feet, but going to the other end of our body. So our grip strength. How does that benefit the body beyond mobility?
So hanging is a category of movements, the way that squatting or walking gets to be a category of movements. And so it's clambering, it's climbing up trees, it's hanging, it's swinging on the monkey bars, it's even pulling stuff. But it's a category of movements that most of us are losing, and it's one that has a lot of benefits for our body. So as you mentioned, there's a shoulder mobility aspect to it. Just getting your hands above your head is an extinct movement for lots of us. There's also a big muscle mass component with it. If you're able to hold the weight of your body with your hands, and if you're able to pull up the weight of your body with your hands, you have a set of upper body muscles that will serve you well, especially as you're getting older. Muscle mass becomes very important to maintain long-term health as we age. But perhaps even more than that, I really like hanging and swinging as a category of movements for what they mean for our upper body bony structures. So our spine, our rib cage, to some degree our shoulders and our shoulder blades. This is all a part of our body that, much like our feet, has been very shaped by modern environments. And what we see, and we don't usually see it early in our lives, but as we get older, we tend to see a very hunched forward upper back, very sticky and immobile, and often a forward head with a big chin lift. And that is a combination of spending a lot of time with our hands in front of us, computing, typing, cooking, a combination of walking, so walking with limited hip mobility does a throwing forward thing to our bodies, and of not using our upper bodies in a wide range of movement. So when you start hanging and swinging, you're starting to create forces that are the exact opposite of those curling forward forces. So it can help to counteract that reshaping of our bodies that happens over time. So I would say that posturally, alignment wise, health wise, it's a very important piece of the puzzle. It also feels great, just like with shoes off. Once you start hanging, you're likely to become a devotee of it for life. If you get monkey bars after this, you will have to send me a picture. But it's a
Yeah.
wonderful feeling of building that particular strength profile back. And what that supports is the space that your heart and lungs have to move in. When your upper back is very hunched forward, you tend to do funky things with your spine and your rib cage to hide that, which has an impact on your core function and your pelvic floor function and your breathing. And of course, it has an impact on your spine and the function and feeling of your back as well. So,
Yeah.
for all those reasons, I think that hanging and all the progressions towards hanging are a really wonderful thing to spend some time on in your movement priority list.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, then that's something I can fully support. I have a lot of online meetings, and the funny thing, between each meeting, I always go outside to my pull-up bar, and I just hang there for like 1 or 2 minutes. It's like, oh, this feels so good, yeah.
So good. So
And then I
good.
go back
Yeah.
to my next meeting. So I'm like, perhaps in a day, I'm hanging like 5, 6 times outside for maybe 2, 3 minutes.
Awesome.
It's really nice, and it's amazing how good that can feel. Yeah, some people think, okay,
Yeah.
that looks so simple, but simple things are sometimes so good. Yeah, great. Thank you for that clarification.
Absolutely. And just like anything, you can build on that one also, So you're hanging with two arms, maybe you
Yeah.
can switch your grip. You can hang with one arm, and then you can add another pull-up bar. So there's
Nice.
there's infinite progressions
Wow.
for you.
Very nice. Well, I'm definitely going to explore more into that. Thanks for those tips. The thing that I still wanted to cover for today is floor sitting. I know that some people even have homes that do not have chairs anymore because they just want to encourage that people can sit on the floor, and then any regular person who would come would not even know how to get to the floor because it's so far away from their from their usual way of sitting. So how can that even improve the overall movement quality?
For sure. Well, this gets us right back to movement nutrition, like we started the podcast talking about. If you sit all of the time in a chair, you are in a very limited range of movement. And if you start exposing your body to floor sitting, what you get is a greater range of motion getting down and up from the floor than you do getting into and out of a chair. And you also have more variety for your hips when you're on the floor. So you can put your body into many more positions than you can when you're in a chair setup, especially our big couches. There's kind of only one way to sit in the couch. It's not totally true, but it tends to be that kind of cashew nut shape. Whereas if you're on the floor, your hips get exposed to much more full range of motion movement. They have to work harder to get you up and down. Your core has to work harder when you're on the floor. There's almost no part of your body that doesn't get a little bit more movement when you're sitting on the floor than when you're sitting in a chair. And you can do it without taking more time from your day. So, as you mentioned, we're all super busy. So, this is a way to just shovel in tons more movement all day, every day that you don't have to take any extra time for. So, in my view, that makes it an absolute no-brainer.
Yeah, fantastic. And another added bonus is that if you are starting to sit on the floor, after a couple of minutes, you'll notice that it's uncomfortable. So you'll move to another position. You naturally start moving more your body. And if you'd be in this super nice, comfortable, fluffy cushion chair, you'd probably be immobile for like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours watching your Netflix. And you maybe just moved your hand to your mouth to put the popcorn in there. But that's about it. So, so therefore, if you would not have that nice cushiony couch, you would probably would have moved in that Netflix film 15 to 20 or more times. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. It gives you more capacity or more options for movement and also more incentive for movement because your body will move naturally because it's a little less comfortable. Although I will jump in and say that just
Mhm.
like hanging, just like shoes, you will serve yourself well to progress into
Yeah.
floor sitting. So almost everyone will sit in a more appropriate position if they have a cushion underneath their sit bones and a cushion of varying height depending on kind of how tight and immobile they're starting with.
Yeah.
So if you're very tight and very uncomfortable on the floor, add some
Hmm.
cushions and you can add them under your knees if you're cross-legged as well as
Hmm.
under your sit bones. There's lots of ways to alter it to make it work for you and then you can adapt better.
Yeah.
So you'll get more out of it if you let yourself adapt than if you
Hmm.
toss yourself in at the deep end, usually.
Exactly. So when we are transitioning to either barefoot shoes or if we are doing more the hanging exercise or sitting on the floor, how do we know the difference between if it's just a pain of progressing and advancing and the pain where you know, okay, that's not a good pain to have? Do you have any like an advice for us to know the difference?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a couple of clues. Number one is trust your gut on that one. If it feels bad, it's probably bad. Your body can usually tell the difference between discomfort and bad. And it's also something where if it feels painful the day after, you probably overdid it. So pain during movement isn't necessarily a sign of a problem, but pain the next day, probably a bit more happened than you really wanted it to.
Okay, very good. Would you say if you have a sharp pain and you know, okay, that came like very sudden, like a sharp pain, could that be more of a sign that maybe I'm doing something wrong, or it doesn't really have to be that way?
I don't know. It's a good question. I tend to think, if your body's giving you a pain signal, it's telling you it wants you to change
Mm.
something. Pain is a really complex and fascinating area that is whole other rabbit hole you could get into. But if my body is hurting when I'm doing something, I usually back off and try to do it
Hmm.
a different way. If it's sharp or if it's achy or if it's something else, I don't know that that matters so much. I think
Yeah.
it's just about listening and being like, okay,
Hmm.
you know what? You don't need to push yourself into pain for the
Yeah.
most part. So why do it?
With that, I would say we have packed so many things into this 1 hour that we spoke today. And for that, I just have one final question, which is the one that I like to ask all of my guests that come to this show is what is your definition of happiness?
Yeah, it's such a hard question. It's such a good question. I ended up kind of thinking about what makes me happy. Like, under what circumstances can I feel like I'm really happy and fulfilled? And I think that the answer to that question is when I'm around a lot of friends, and especially movement friends. All friends are great, but my friends who I can move with, there's something special about that. And all the trainings I've ever done, where we've been with a group of other teachers and we've gone on walks together, and somebody's climbing on a tree and someone's walking barefoot on the beach, and then we come back and we have a big dinner together, we all sit on the floor. That for me, that's pretty much peak experience for me.
Wow, amazing. That is so nice. I just have that image in my head. Wow,
Mhm.
thank you for sharing that. That's a nice definition of happiness. I've heard so many versions of what is happiness for a person, and this one is very unique. Thanks for sharing that, Petra. And well,
I'm glad I could glad I could help.
great. So I will put a lot of the things that we spoke about today in the show notes for our audience, and especially the links to your programs as well, and to your website, as well as to your Instagram account. Is there anything you would like to share before we close the call for today?
Yeah, I think that probably it's really nice to make sure you like a teacher before you take their programs. So if anybody is interested in working on their feet and transitioning to barefoot shoes, I would say a great place to start is my Free Your Feet program, which is a free email exercise program to help people work on restoring their foot health. And it's got some of my favorite basic foot restoration exercises. So that's probably a really nice place to get introduced to my work and to do a lot of good for your feet in a really accessible way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Petra, for all of that great advice, lots of learning nuggets, and looking forward to seeing you very soon again in case you come to Spain someday. Thank you so much. Take care, Petra.
Thanks so much, Juan. You look after yourself.
Thanks. Bye
Okay,
bye.
bye.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Health, Happiness, and Planet podcast with Petra Fisher. Her journey from chronic pain to pain-free movement is a reminder that small, mindful changes can lead to profound results. Foot health, as Petra shared, isn't just about your feet. It's the foundation for your entire body's well-being. From understanding how modern shoes impact us to simple yet effective practices like floor sitting, hanging, and strengthening your grip, Petra's insights offer actionable ways to move more naturally and feel better every day. If you're curious to learn more, be sure to check out her Build Better Feet program and other outstanding programs offered by Petra and start your journey towards improving your mobility, vitality, and your life. If you found value in this conversation, share it with someone who could benefit from it. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes focused on living healthier, happier, and in harmony with our planet. Until next time, keep moving, stay mindful, and take care of yourself. Big hugs, everyone.